Great. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our final workshop from the Food Fest celebration at St. Petersburg College, hosted by Learning Resources and Student Life. We want to thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your participation today. This is intended to be an interactive session, and we encourage you to participate and ask questions. You're welcome to do so by either placing your questions in the chat box or feel free just to unmute your mic. My name is Heather Meyer, and I'm a librarian at the Clearwater campus. And joining me today is David Monroe, our guest presenter from the Ethics Department. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the presentation to him. Welcome, Professor Monroe.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Heather. I think most of the folks who are here may not have needed it, because I think I know the majority of them already, and they've heard my voice plenty. It's nice to be here in a slightly different capacity, because what I'm going to do is share a little bit of my actual research with folks today, which in an ethics class I work very hard not to do. It's not my business to tell them what to think about ethics, but it will be my business to tell them what to think about food. I fell into this line of research almost by accident. Prior to going to university and getting my graduate degrees, I was a chef. And so naturally, one of the first things that I gravitated towards thinking about was philosophical questions related to food. So as a product of my one of my degrees, I fell into working with a guy called Fritz Alhoff, who was also interested in similar questions. And I got connected to a kind of philosophy of food community that's out there. And there are some really interesting questions related to the philosophy of taste. So if I have any mark as a researcher, and if I do, it's very, very small, it's in this pretty tiny little field about philosophy of taste, where I'm actually more well known than I am for my thinking about ethics. So it's probably a safe thing to say that most of the time we don't spend a good deal of our time thinking about eating, right? Most of the time we don't think about food as a kind of object of contemplation. Most of the time we think about food as a matter of necessity. So we eat because we're hungry. And in our society, we eat because we're trying to fuel ourselves, right? We have this tendency to think of food as what we get on the way to doing something else. And that's been, I think, pretty heavily institutionalized in our country. So we think about fast food restaurants, the place you drive through, right? You're driving through, it's a necessity that you have to satisfy on your way to something that's considered to be more important, right? When you think about school lunches and the way that we feed children when they're in the learning environment, we don't typically think about our cafeterias as interesting spaces of learning. We think about those as places where we're just trying to fuel up the kids to get them on to the next class. And unfortunately, entirely too often with that context, now we think about cafeterias as spaces where we're trying to correct some social injustices, right? So in many cities, school lunches are used to feed people who are at a disadvantage, right? They can't afford food themselves, and so they're being fed while they're at school. No, why the hell am I talking about all this? It just seems like a completely random sort of thing, given the topic of the talk, which is beyond nutrition, rethinking the importance of food for quality of life, right? So we recognize that there is a relationship between what we eat and the quality of our lives, right? And let me just for a moment stop and sort of broadly define what we mean when we talk about quality of life. It's a concept that we in Western thought have been working with since around the time of the ancient Greeks, where they had a term called eudaimonia to refer to a life that's well lived. And philosophers like Aristotle specified a variety of conditions that one had to meet in order to enjoy a high quality of life, or to be able to say that you're living well. Right? So your life is going well for you from your vantage point or your point of view. And a very often recognized contributor to quality of life is health, right? And so what you might call our sort of standard view of the importance of food, and by standard view, I mean the way that we start thinking about the connection between food and quality of life, is by thinking about its relationship to the concept of health, right? So we all want to have this sort of good, well-lived life, and health is one of the ways that we achieve that, or one of the things that has to be in place in order for us to enjoy it. And in order to be healthy, in some way, we have to watch what we eat, right? And would you guys agree, just generally, you can write yes or no in the chat, that that's more or less the kind of standard view when we start thinking about food? That we think about it in health terms?
Got a lot of yeses.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing some yeses there. Yeah, and I mean, it seems to me that there's nothing necessarily wrong about that. And it seems like being healthy is important, right? I mean, being unhealthy, we can see that there's I think now more than ever, we recognize a connection between feeling healthy, feeling good, and life being positive, uplifting, going well for us, and so on. But I do think, excuse me, in some ways, the issue with this is that like most things that sort of fall under the category of health, we're also living in what you might call a kind of quantitative healthcare paradigm. Okay. And that's, let me spell that out just a little bit, but the quantitative healthcare paradigm is one that's driven by things like statistics, right? So biostatistics and using math and things like that to measure concepts in terms of health, right? Or health in terms of concepts. Let me put that the right way. So the example that bothers me the most probably about this way of thinking is when we talk about obesity, we reduce that down, or most healthcare practitioners reduce that down to what's called body mass index, right? So are you guys familiar with the body mass index, or the BMI measurement of obesity? Am I getting looks like I'm getting some yeses.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so right, so if I want to figure out how obese I am, what I do is do some formula where I multiply some ratio of my height versus my body weight, and that ostensibly tells me how overweight I am, right? But if we think about that for more than 2 seconds, we can see how inadequate that is as a measure of body fat, right? Because there are so many other variables that factor into your body mass, like bone density, like your muscles, right? Like your muscle density. It may be that some people are just sort of genetically thicker than others, you might say, right? And so while one person might look obese on that scale, they're actually rock climbers, like someone who's in really good shape, right? So we see right off the bat the inadequacy of this sort of medical or numerical quantificational model of healthcare, if we think about that. But think about how much that influences the way that we think about food, right? So if you go to the grocery store and you look at the back of a food package, it lists some ingredients and then it tells you amounts of stuff, right? And if you talk to a nutritionist or a dietitian, they're going to talk to you about the kinds of foods that you should eat, and they're going to prescribe that to you largely in terms of amounts of stuff. They're going to say, well, the average diet is X number of calories per day, right? So based on a 2,000 calorie a day diet, and don't eat more than X number of carbs of sugar, or X number of grams of sugar, or X number of grams of carbs, or X number of grams of fat, or what have you, right? So almost every healthcare prescription or any recommendation with respect to dietary behaviors is spelled out mathematically in that way, right? But almost never do you see anything on a package of food or a food label or from a recommendation from a nutritionist about what you're actually eating, right? It's spelled out in this sort of numerical terms. 2,000 calories of what, right? As far as the whole thing that you're eating. Because as you sit down and enjoy a piece of cheesecake, there might be this sign next to it that says it's, 5,000 calories or something absurd like that. Inducing a kind of weird moral guilt that you have about eating this thing that's more than your daily recommended dose. But what's entirely missing from that picture is why you'd be eating the cheesecake in the first place, right? And why do we eat cheesecake? Is it because of its caloric content? Because it's got X number of fat grams or what have you?
Because it tastes good.
Because it tastes good, right? Yeah, because it's delicious, right? Yeah, so some of us get sad, says Ernie. That's funny. Yeah, some of us do get sad when we look at that sort of thing. And I'm not entirely sure it's accidental that we feel bad about some of those choices. And I think that's because the healthcare practitioner is aiming at something very specific, right? They want to give us reasons to care about our health. And once we have reasons to care about our health, well, then the idea is we'll address that. And then presumably in some way that leads to us having a good quality of life, right? Healthcare people, dietitians, and so on, they're trying to help us, right? They want us to live good lives by being healthy, right? And if that's one of the conditions to have a good life, then they're earnest in trying to help us figure that out, right? Another way of putting that basically is to say that couching food choices in terms of health gives us a kind of internal reason to care about what we're eating, right? If it's connected in some way with us enjoying our lives, then nobody should have to convince us. It should just come naturally to us to say, well, yeah, you care about being healthy, so watch what you eat. Of course, we know it's more complicated than that. Another thing that the nutritional focus gives us, I think, is a way of getting at food justice questions, which I think obviously we all get, right? You guys probably know that 1 in 5 people in Tampa Bay before the pandemic was what we call food insecure, meaning 20% of the people in Pinellas County didn't have enough to eat and were a bounced paycheck away from basically starvation conditions. And that's to say nothing of the food insecurity issues in other parts of the world. If we take seriously the idea that food is connected to health and health is connected to quality of life, now we have a way of saying, all right, these food distribution questions matter because we're denying other people the opportunity to live fulfilling lives if they're starving to death, right? So it's got both a kind of intrinsic personal motivation and it gives sort of an external moral motivation, right? So we should care about food because it matters, it's justice issues, and it matters to us in our own quality of life. Okay, so let me move on. Would you guys like me to share my PowerPoint? Like, I don't actually do this in class. I don't use PowerPoints, but I'm happy to. Let's get a vote in the chat. Who would like me to use my PowerPoint, yes or no? Okay, drat. I was hoping you'd say no, but here we go. All right, let me share my screen. Wait a bit, let me see here. Why am I not seeing my PowerPoint showing up there? Sorry, guys, give me half a second here. There we go. Put on the presentation mode. You can tell how often I use PowerPoint because I can't figure out how to start it. Okay, so there are some important weaknesses with the standard view, and that's worth thinking about, right? And I already mentioned the first one, that part of the problem is it operates too much in a statistically normed model of healthcare. So we're thinking about what counts as average in terms of body weight and height and health and so on. We talked about breaking it down to the numerical elements like the grams of carbohydrates and so on. And again, it doesn't pay any attention to the way that things taste, right? That would be our sort of qualitative experiences of stuff. So if I eat a cheeseburger, I'm not paying attention to the calories. I'm paying attention to the way, the texture of the cheese, or I'm paying attention to the smell or the sight of the steam, the flavor of the whatever the cheeseburger is made of. In my case, it wouldn't be made of beef, but you know, that sort of thing, right? How all of those other experiential aspects that really make eating significant in a fuller sense than just, you know, counting carbs. Now, there we go. Now, part of my thinking is informed by a guy called Michel Serres. In 1985, he wrote a book called The Five Senses, where he's encouraging us to sort of lose this obsession with quantity, right? To get past this idea that we should think about our experiences in a sort of mathematized or even scientific way. Now, just to pause briefly, those of you guys who are in my intro to philosophy class will recall we just talked about questions about knowledge, right? How do we know things about the external world? How do our senses relate to a world outside of the mind, and so on? And those are part of the questions that Sarah is trying to deal with here. Like, what do our senses tell us about reality? And he points out in this book that one of the problems with our way of thinking about our experiences and about talking about the world And in connection with this sort of mathematical model of thinking about our experiences and concepts like health, is that we have a kind of internal bias about our sense perception, that we have an excessive privileging of the sense of sight, and we demean the other senses, and in some ways, importantly, deny their or significantly deny their importance, right? So vision is our sort of paradigm sense. Everything that we see, that's sort of like, I should say, the best human sense that we've got. We experience the world visually because we can see things at a distance, and we can say, well, that thing exists over there, and we can look at those things and make predictions about how they behave, right? So think about the very beginning of the scientific method. It starts with what we call observation, which is a vision word, right? To be observed. So our sciences start assuming that vision is the paradigm sense. And then Serres argues that there's a kind of hierarchy that follows, that sound is second, touch is third, smell is fourth, and taste is last, right? So taste is not important at all. Now, why is taste not important at all? Well, traditionally, philosophers have argued that taste doesn't matter because it's what we call subjective, right? It doesn't really give us actual facts about the world, because we have so many differences of opinion about how things taste that we wouldn't really call that knowledge giving. That's just a judgment that you're making based on your own subjective person, right? So for example, the English philosopher John Locke divides our experiences up into what we call primary qualities and secondary qualities. The secondary qualities of our experiences are those that are purely subjective, and we only have them because of something about us, right? So our sense of taste may differ. And so there is no actual taste. That's just about your senses and the way that you interact with the thing that you eat. Whereas he talks about primary qualities being things like that belong to the object themselves, like their shape, right? And we see their shape. We don't taste the shape. And so vision gives us actual knowledge. So, taste gives us kind of like subjective preferences, you might say, right? Or it's entirely subjective experience. And there's an old Latin saying, de gustibus est non disputandum, which is to say there's no disputing about taste, right? There is no fact of the matter about it. It's just up to you. And Serres challenges that and says, look, we need to lose the obsession with quantity, and we start by losing our obsession with vision, that there's something important about these other senses. And thinking about it the way that we traditionally have, in a way, limits the kinds of experiences that we're able to have. And unnecessarily limiting our experiences, he argues, cuts off opportunities to experience the world in new and interesting ways, right? And taste, he's going to say, is one of those ways that we can do it. So when we talk about taste, we need to be sort of clear about what we mean, because it can mean a variety of different things, right? So those of you guys who are in my class, we remember the task of definition. We want to define our terms very clearly. Let's be clear what we mean about taste, because it could be three different things, I'm going to say. First, it can be the literal taste sensations that we have, right? When you bite into a lemon, you taste bitterness and sourness. If you bite into a chocolate chip cookie, you're going to taste its sweetness. So these are the literal taste sensations that your tongue, the information that your tongue processes. That's one meaning of the word taste. Now, a second meaning that is the heart of the objection that I just gave you guys, as far as the dismissal of taste as an important sense, is that it seems to be tied up with this idea of personal preferences and desires, right? We say, well, we all have our own tastes. Those of you who are in my ethics class know that I actually hate cheesecake, and I wouldn't eat it if I was forced to. And the same thing with fettuccine Alfredo. They're disgusting and nobody should eat them, I might say. And of course you'd say, what? That's crazy. Everybody likes cheesecake. Everybody likes fettuccine Alfredo. And there what we're talking about basically is a description of the preferences that I have, and they're being at odds with yours, right? So when we talk about taste, that's one thing that we mean. But there's a third sense, and this is what Serres is on about, that I think is an important insight, that what we also mean by taste is a capacity for appreciation and reflective aesthetic or artistic judgment, right? And that's something different than just your preferences or desires, right? You may not like a thing and you may not want it, but you can still, in some ways, develop a capacity to appreciate it, understand what makes it good, and think about its value, right, separately. So, for example, given the fact that I was a chef, I really do hate cheesecake. I'm not lying about that. But if I tried a piece of cheesecake, I could tell you whether it was good cheesecake or bad cheesecake. Do you guys understand what I mean? Basically, do you get the gist of what I'm saying? Okay. So what Serres argues, and I think he's right about, I'm sort of picking up where he leaves off, is this idea that this third sense is the one that's necessary for having a good life, right? So eating is important to us, not just because it's tied to our health. Eating is important for independent reasons and the way that we eat, because in some other way, it's going to contribute to our having a good life, right? Not just about nutrition, not just about counting calories and working them off on the treadmill if you eat that piece of cheesecake or something like that. There's something else that's going on, and it's going to involve this capacity for appreciation and reflective artistic judgment. Right? So what's so great about taste? Like, what does it do for us? I mean, the other older philosophers said, well, look, taste is this completely useless sense. It's just about subjective preferences and so on. But Serres points out an interesting thing about our species designation. Do you guys know what the species designation for human beings is? The Latin term for a human being. You guys all know it. That's right, Homo sapien. That's right, Homo sapien, right? And usually that's interpreted to mean that we're a thinking thing, right? That we have the capacity for knowledge and wisdom, right? So we're the wise hominid. But Serres points out that its root word sapere in Latin means alternately having aesthetic taste, having wisdom, or having knowledge. And so we might argue, and I think this is the way to go, that what we might say about Homo sapiens is that means man the taster rather than man the thinker, right? Or humanity the thinker or humanity the taster, right? As opposed to thinking about it in its more traditional sense. So the implication there is that cultivated taste is related to knowledge and wisdom, not health, right? It's not a question of whether or not you're healthy, whether or not you're fit, whether or not your organs are working well, that sort of thing. If there's another connection between food and having a good life, it will be down this path, that developing our sapience means developing our capacity for artistic and aesthetic appreciation, because that relates to our ability to be wise and to gain knowledge. And those things also seem to be really important to living a well-lived human life, right? That we come to know, as Aristotle once said, all people by nature desire to know. That's part of what it means to be a human being. And we don't just want to know facts. We also want to know important things, questions about how to live, sort of the wisdom side of this. So we might argue that learning how to taste food contributes importantly to developing our capacities for knowledge and wisdom, right? So that's sort of the direction that we're headed. Right off the bat, that seems a little bit grandiose. Do you think that learning how to taste food is going to make you smarter and wiser? Does that seem weird to anybody? Okay, because most of the time you think, well, what makes me smarter and wiser is that I go to school and I learn about science, right? Or I learn about ethics or philosophy. And, I study stuff and I spit it out in the book, and, I watch documentaries and I read newspapers, right? That's where knowledge comes from. You're telling me that knowledge comes from eating? How the hell does that happen? Right? That's a really weird thing to say. So we've got some explaining to do here. Like, what's the connection between those things? Well, how does taste give us knowledge and wisdom? Right? That essentially is the question we're confronted with. Some of this might sound a little bit cheesy to you guys and almost like a cliche, and there's something sort of cliche about it, right? And I'm not going to deny that. But one thing that tasting does is give us connections to remote times and places, right? And it allows us to bridge sort of cultural and historical gaps, right? Okay, so let me explain to you briefly sort of what that means. or give you an example that might help you understand it. So one thing I'll admit, I was lucky enough to grow up in a really multicultural household. I have an aunt and uncle, or I'm sorry, an aunt and cousins who are Vietnamese Buddhists. And my stepfather is from Lebanon. He was an immigrant that came over from the Middle East during the troubles in Beirut. So I grew up in a house where I learned to eat things like hummus, and I learned to eat things like spring rolls, and I learned to eat things like pad thai or kibbeh, or a lot of traditional dishes that regular old-fashioned Midwestern folks don't eat, right? I grew up in steak and potatoes country, but I had connections to these other places geographically and culturally, not because I'd ever visited the Middle East, and I still haven't, not because I've ever visited Southeast Asia, and I still haven't, but because I had those relationships through the food to those places. I have at least a glimpse of what life is like in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia. Because it isn't a far stretch to say that the cuisines that cultures come up with are as much a product of their geography as they are their demography, meaning they're as much determined by what can grow and what you can get as it is the culture of the people. So for example, in the Middle East, you're not going to find a whole bunch of, ribeyes on the menu because beef is scarcer. They're not able to grow or raise cattle the way that we're in Europe, right? So the way that food is handled and the way it is served and thought of is geographically and culturally conditioned, right? So not only does eating a certain cuisine put you in touch with the people, it puts you in touch with the place, right? Thinking deeply about this, and this is the folks in Intro to Philosophy will probably appreciate this just a little bit more than some of the other folks, because we haven't talked about this in ethics, and we never will, because it's not really relevant as far as ethics is concerned. But when we start thinking about this idea of connections to remote places and remote times, we start to rethink what time and space mean, right? And that's what sort of deep philosophical thinking, like what is time and what is space. And if you guys watch those nature biographies, I can't think of the guy's name, or not biographies, good Lord, documentaries. There's the guy who does the series on time and space on the Science Channel, right? And he's a physicist, and he's talking about space and time through the lens of physics. And you can talk about space and time through the lens of algebra, right? The way that Rene Descartes does. Do you guys remember Cartesian coordinates from your algebra class, where you do the equation and you have like the X and Y axis, and then you plot points on that using algebra? But yes, that's exactly right. Kaku. I'm sure I mispronounced that. That's the guy I was thinking of. Thank you, Magda. Well, that's one way of thinking about space. There's like this two-dimensional thing, like a map, where you can put points. Or you can think of space as being like this water bottle. Intro to Philosophy people, I worked in a water bottle example. Space could be like this water bottle. It's a container where you put stuff, right? There's a vacuum, and then you put things in it, which is the way that we used to talk about outer space, right? That it's this vacuum where things exist, sort of suspended in it. Or we might think about space a little bit more strangely, that it's not a plane, it's not a container. Perhaps space and time are like a handkerchief, right? Or we think about them topologically, right? So if you look at this convenient paper towel that I've got in my hands, right now it looks flat. And I might put something in it and wrap it around it, right? So it becomes a container. But if I take this paper towel that I've got here in my hands, I've got my forefinger and thumb at this far extreme, and I have my forefinger and thumb at this far extreme. On a sort of geometrical way of thinking about this, my hands are very far apart, right? They're as distant as they could be and still be related in this space. But if I fold them over, now those remote times and places are touching, right? And if I fold it over again, well, then I have more contact with different times and places. And if I fold it over again, and so on, right? So before long, if we just crumple this thing up, what looked like it was far apart is really very close together. And so in thinking about the way that food and our sense of taste connects us to different times and places, we may start thinking about space and time in ways that we call topological, which has to do with folds and knots and twists. And we may think that, well, what looks like it's in the distant past is actually present. And what looks like it's far away is actually very close. And it's through thinking about taste that helps us see this. Now, I've given you guys some examples in terms of space, right? I'm visiting Lebanon when I eat my stepdad's cooking. But what about time? Does anyone like wine? Some of you might be too young to like wine, but anyone wine tasters here? Allison, okay. Thanks, Allison. I'm glad there's at least one person.
I'm not a taster, but I don't wine taste, but I do like wine.
Well, there you go. So some of this will make sense, right? And if you get into wine tasting as a hobby, this becomes more and more apparent that you can taste the differences in wine partly by what happens in a given year, right? It's a concept that wine people call terroir, and it has to do with the conditions under which wine is grown. So some years are drier, some years are wetter, some years vines get more sun, some years they don't. Some years there's a disease, some years there's not, right? So there's all these sort of time-related things that affect what a wine tastes like. And really good wine tasters can actually taste those differences. So this brand of wine made this year will taste different than the same brand of wine, the vintage of another year, right? And that's, I think it's a little snooty, right? I'll grant you it's a little bit snooty. But what that shows us basically is that time is bottled, right? It's that year that we're tasting, that place, that time together in that bottle of wine, which is unique and will be different from the next year's taste, its time, its place. So you can think of it kind of being like the rings in a tree, right? You can see what happens to a tree by the effects on its rings. And so it's a similar kind of concept. So taste tells us about space and time themselves, that they're folded, that they're not a container, that they're not a place where you plot coordinates. Yeah, maybe I should get a job for one, Cassie. That's a side gig. So it also activates our broader capacities for appreciation. If we learn to start paying attention to things like the way things taste and don't focus on what we're eating, it tunes us into looking for aesthetic qualities in other contexts, right? And I mentioned this earlier in my intro to philosophy class today. All of our senses are capable of refinement, right? We don't get them and aren't experts at using them. And we don't typically think of them in that way, right? Being an expert seer or using your vision, that's something that you can train. You can become better at noticing things, right, visually. In the same way that when you take a music appreciation class, you become better at hearing things in music. You notice things that an untrained ear won't notice. The same thing is true here with food, right? The more you train your palate and you refine your sense of taste and smell, the more that broadens your capacity for artistic appreciation in general. So the genuinely excellent perceiver is one who not only refines their taste and smell, but their sense of hearing and their sense of sight. And that makes us better at enjoying art in general. That's right. Victoria says, so it's just savoring and notice details and enjoying the moment. That's about right. And you notice that the more that you do those kinds of things, the next time you have an experience like that, the more you'll notice, right? So it's got this, the sort of broadening of horizons, as the cheesy metaphor goes, is legitimate because it's broadening your capacities to notice things, which then makes it easier for you to understand and appreciate what you're experiencing, right? Any questions before I go on, or comments? Yes, Allison, exactly. Like you can eventually smell when your recipe is off. That's exactly right. Excellent point. Write your favorite food in the chat, please, if you don't mind. Oh, Heather, nice.
Pretty much anything spicy.
Yeah. Pad Thai, Fajitas, good. Chicken thighs. Pierogies. Yeah, that's good stuff. Sweet potato pie, Ruth. This is your season. Yeah, I actually just had curry for lunch. Steaks.
Nice.
Yeah. Pedro, you may have to help me out with that one.
Do you like Thai curry or Indian curry?
I like both.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. I was saying earlier in one of my classes, to a student asked me about how to make Thai food, and yeah, that's right. And I used to work in an Asian restaurant in Seattle, and we made Thai food. I can never make it right at home, but the cuisine that I'm absolutely worst at making is Indian food. And so I'll usually order Indian curries because I can never come anywhere close to replicating them, where I can do okay with Thai.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had Japanese curry also. Yeah. Vietnamese food, yeah. Cheese bread, okay. Well, cheese and bread, I mean, that's just a natural combination, isn't it? Okay, so yeah, I did notice that no single person wrote, not a single person wrote the lowest calorie diet soda, right? No person wrote a Whopper, right? No person wrote, a television dinner or something like that, right? Because even though we do eat for convenience, the things that are our favorites are always the one that give us those really rich qualitative experiences, right? And so in a way, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys are already all on board. Now I'm just giving us a kind of philosophical defense. You don't know anyone who eats Burger King? I eat Burger King. Rice cakes. Well done, Ruth. Yes. And there are all kinds of food that like diet, like they market themselves as being healthier, like because they're lower calorie or what have you. And yeah, so people will get themselves to eat some pretty wretched things. But then what are they waiting for? They're waiting for cheat day. Like, I'm going to eat what I actually want to eat. That's Michelle, or sorry, Johan, that's funny. That's funny. Okay, so what are some implications of this? And here I think are some interesting things to think about that may seem kind of silly at first glance, but oops, I went the wrong way. If we're serious about questions of food justice, this should suggest to us that we shouldn't just be worried about meeting people's nutritional needs, right? Which is all too often how those discussions go, right? People will donate non-perishable food for good reasons. It lasts and you can get it to places of need and so on. But very, very rarely is the focus ever on giving somebody something decent to eat. It's more about just making sure that they're not starving to death. And my suggestion here is that if we are really serious about promoting people's quality of lives, we have to take the qualitative dimension in when we ask the questions about food justice, right? So if I sent a whole bunch of TV dinners to a group of starving people in some other country, in some way I'm doing them a disservice. Like, they may not die because now they have something to eat, and that's a good thing. But by the same token, do we really want them eating TV dinners? Or might it be the case that we work to build some of these culinary bridges or these food bridges where maybe we take the time to learn a bit about their culture and what they eat and try to meet them where they're at by providing them food that not only sustains their life, but makes them feel fulfilled in some way. And now maybe we use those as opportunities to help them learn about other ways of life and other cultures, as opposed to just thinking about ways to keep them alive, right? Which is necessary, but an impoverished or nearsighted view, right? Where we could actually broaden the horizons a little bit and think, let's look at this from another perspective. It should also cause us to rethink our approach to food in institutionalized settings, right? You guys probably remember, I'm certain that it was true for most of you guys, where pizza day happens at school and the pizza is so greasy, you can lay your napkin on it and you pick up the napkin and it's like it's become a window. It's no longer a napkin because the grease has made it transparent, right? Yes or no in the chat if you ever had that experience. It is nasty. Now, the old saying from being a chef is, yeah, that's right, Fridays is pizza day. Fat is flavor, right? So you're going to get kids to eat it just because it's fatty, right, or sweet or something like that. But yeah, we need to think about food not just as being that thing that we deal with as a matter of necessity. Our first relationship to it, or at least our only relationship to it, shouldn't be thinking about it as a kind of nutritional necessity moving from one point to the next. That kids in schools should not go to lunchrooms where the food is barely edible, where it's nutritionally questionable, and the only reason it's there is economics, right? The reason of cost, which is all too often the case. That's right. Exactly right. No, you're quite right. And you might have missed that at the beginning. I think one of my worries is that these institutionalized settings are the only place that some of these people get to eat. And some of you have heard me complain about Detroit public schools where my stepdad works and the conditions there. And there are a lot of students there who that is where they eat because they're not getting fed at home. So it makes it all the more important that we say, well, look, we need to teach these people how to eat, not just give them something to eat. We need to use these as learning opportunities. If it's true that we gain insights about remote places and times through eating, if it's true that we form these contacts with other cultures, if it's true that these eating experiences give us actual philosophical insights, right? The suggestions about space and time, then by thinking about food in the quantitative way, what we do is we rob people of these opportunities. We're not, in some ways, we're stunting their growth, you might say, as a human being. And we should rethink then the cafe on campus or the student or the school lunchroom as being a space of learning and not a space of meeting basic necessities or needs, right? Now, is that cost effective? Probably not. Right? It would be difficult in some ways to, you can't really do gourmet lunch every day in a cafeteria of 1,000 kids, but it can damn sure come further than where it's been. Right? I mean, there's a middle ground there where we might work to improve what we do, even if it doesn't get us all the way to making us gourmands, you might say. And it also gets us to the point where we can say culinary education is an epistemologically significant method of instruction. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the lingo, epistemology has to do with the theory of knowledge, right? So we think about science as being epistemologically significant because natural sciences tell us something about the world. We think about mathematics as being epistemologically significant because it tells us something about mathematical relationships, and that helps us do things with the world. So math and science give us this kind of engineering, right? You learn science because it tells you about nature. You learn math because it helps you manipulate nature and do other things. But the suggestion here is, if this is true, then culinary education, while it may be not the same or in some ways as useful as math or science, nevertheless is an important thing to study because it tells us interesting things about the world. So that may have curricular implications like whatever happened to home ec, right? I don't know, how many of you guys had home economics classes still in your high schools? And Ruth, yeah, I'm not, or Allison did. Okay. Okay, so it is an elective, right? Okay, that's good to know because by the time I was in high school, they had eliminated it. And my understanding is that's generally true because it was dismissed as not academically important, right? That it doesn't matter. And you should focus on what's the stuff now, the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, all of which are useful, but that's to rule out a whole range of things that might be epistemologically significant in their own way. Right. And so culinary education or home ec might be an opportunity for students to engage in those kinds of experiences that make them a more well-rounded person. And yes, it is important as a life skill, except that if you don't have that life skill, what do? Well, you go buy TV dinners and you drive through the fast food restaurant or you order pizza, right? So I don't want to impute too many impure motives to people, but I don't think it's accidental that they don't want you to learn how to cook anymore. That was very conspiracy theorist. Forgive me. All right. I see some life in the chat. You guys have questions, hit me. So Pedro, you were in culinary school right before you came here? Oh, that's fun. Well, let me just say too, you don't necessarily have to be a chef to appreciate the stuff, right? And that's not necessary. It's not like you have to learn how to cook in order to appreciate the taste. But it is important to learn how to taste independently because it helps us have a good life, helps us develop knowledge, helps us develop wisdom, and so on. Well, while you guys are thinking of questions, I do have a list of suggested readings if anyone wants to see the kinds of things that are where people are talking about this stuff and influencing my thinking and the thinking of others. And since this is put on by the libraries, it seems appropriate to recommend some books.
I do like that.
Yeah. So a little bit of selfish self-promotion. The first one at the top of the list is an anthology of essays that I edited with my friend Fritz Allhoff called Food and Philosophy, Eat, Think, and Be Merry. It's published by Wiley Blackwell. The second one, Boisvert and Heldke, Philosophers at Table, just came out a couple years ago, and they were influenced by Michel Serres. I've listed his 5 senses there. There's this really cool institute, guys. If you like this sort of stuff, want to pursue it, in Milan, in Italy, there's an entire university, the whole purpose of which is food and culinary studies. And they've got an entire department that's philosophy of food, where all they do is sit around and think about the sense of taste and drink wine and eat really good food, I imagine.